And I guess I could also, oh, why is it projecting on that one? I could apologize for that, why it's projecting on the wrong one. And then I could also apologize for, there we go. I could apologize again for that chart of stuff that I gave you, but I won't apologize for that. You're actually welcome for that because it will increase your understanding of bacteria and archaeans, so you're welcome. All right, chapter 25. So we are going to do our best to get through the first 3 framing questions today, but only the first 2 are on the exam because I was not confident in our ability to get through all 3. So anyways, why don't land plants have some of the pigments in red and brown algae? Why do algae produce drought-resistant structures? And then maybe, just maybe, why can mosses grow where there isn't any soil? That's pretty unusual for plants. Anyways, we'll deal with that in just a moment. All right, so here, before we get into answering this first question or addressing this first question, I need you to remind you that we have 6 drawers in our file cabinet that is eukaryotes, right? Do you remember talking about that? We've got the file cabinet, it's got 6 drawers, and you know the title of those 6 drawers, right? I actually saw one person nod their head. That's awesome if you do. It's excavata, chrome alveolata, rhizaria, archaeplastida, opisthoconta, and amoebozoa. There we go. There are the 6. I was trying to get them in the right order, but I skipped one and had to come back to it. Are you going to ask, do you need to know those? You don't. But I'm just saying you do know them, right? I'm assuming that you know them. I won't assess whether or not you know them because I don't want to know that you don't know them, right? So, but we've got 6 of these drawers. The reason why I'm skipping fungi and going to plants is because the idea is that the drawer that fungi belong in is the same drawer that animals belong in. And so I want to deal with those together rather than doing fungi and then plants, okay? Because I want you to determine for yourself, do they belong in the same drawer? And if we're going to do that, we got to work through them together, okay? But we're going to deal with plants right now, and plants, just for your frame of reference, plants are in the drawer titled Archaeplastida. And in that drawer with plants, this you do need to know. You don't need to know Archaeplastida yet. But what you do need to know is that in that same drawer are green algae. Not red algae, not brown algae, but green algae. Okay? And you're like, why is he saying algae and not algae? Either both are correct, but algae is the British pronunciation. I'm feeling like pronouncing it with British pronunciation today. All right? So red algae, brown algae are not believed to be closely related to plants. Green algae are. Okay? All right? We okay? They're in the same drawer. All right, so first question, why don't land plants have some of the pigments in red and brown algae? Okay? When I said not quite yet, now you need to know Archaeplastida because now it's on the slide. Okay? So inside of Archaeplastida, you find plants and green algae. The idea here is that photosynthesis started 1.65 billion years ago when you got your first chloroplast, okay? Actually, that's not true. Photosynthesis would have started before that, but you generate your first chloroplast the same way the idea is that you generated mitochondria. We talked about that on Friday, right? What's the idea of where mitochondria came from? Somebody explain this to me because I have forgotten over my emotional roller coaster of a weekend. Allison. Yes. 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 And the idea is that chloroplast came from the same mechanism, but instead of engulfing an aerobic bacterium, it engulfed a photosynthetic bacterium. And that's how you get your first chloroplast, approximately 1.65 billion years ago. And so the idea is that green algae and plants come from the same photosynthetic ancestor, okay? green algae and plants. These are plants, and here are green algae. Okay, green algae and plants, or plants and green algae, come from the same ancestor. So they came from an ancestor that had phagocytized a photosynthetic bacterium and then gave rise to green algae and plants. All other photosynthetic eukaryotes developed their photosynthetic capabilities separately. They also phagocytized a photosynthetic bacterium, but in a separate event than what generated green algae and plants. You're like, wow, this is kind of cool. So not only are we generating mitochondria and chloroplast by one bacterium eating another, and we talked about the challenges of that on Friday. I see your hand, Emerson. I'll come to you in just a second. Not only did we talk about the challenges of that on Friday, but it doesn't need to just happen once. It has to happen a lot of times, many times. So many times you need to eat something and not eat it, right? We don't have a mechanism for that. Many times you have to develop a means by which you communicate with something that showed up inside you for the very first time. And we have no mechanism for that. And you need to generate a mechanism by which you can take DNA out of what you just ate but didn't eat, put it in your own DNA, which we sort of have that, right? We talked about viruses, maybe could have done that. But then also you need to change the language. And not only do we not have a mechanism for that, but there's no even like proposed way in which that could happen. But assuming we could make all that happen, we don't just need to do it once, we need to do it many times. Hang on, Emerson needs to go first, and then you can go, Michael. Emerson.
What, other than the coloring, are like the fundamental differences between green algae versus like brown and red?
Yeah, so the reason why they're colored differently is because they have different pigments. So, well, I mean, those aren't the only differences, but that's why they're colored differently. They have different pigments. And so the pigments absorb certain wavelengths of light, reflect others. And so chlorophyll is the pigment in plants and green algae. And the reason why it's green is because it absorbs all visible light except green and reflects that back, and that's what you see. Okay? So then there are other types of chlorophyll that absorb different wavelengths of light. And that's one of the reasons why they think that brown algae, red algae, green algae, and land plants don't all share the same eukaryotic ancestor, because they would have had to have phagocytized different photosynthetic bacteria to account for the different pigments. But then there are other chemical differences, that some of which result from the differences in pigment. Yeah. Micah.
When you say we don't have a mechanism for that, you're talking about we haven't seen that in cells?
Correct.
Not humans don't have.
I mean, yeah. I mean, I could build you a simple machine that would eat something and not eat it, right? I mean, that's like a sock puppet, you know? It's like there's a simple machine that ate my hand, but didn't consume it. Oh man. So the one bright spot of this weekend, besides the Dodgers winning on Friday and Saturday, is my 3-year-old daughter turned 3 yesterday, and my mom got her a cat, not a real cat, because she knows better. But it's I don't even know what you would. I mean, it's made of plastic and cloth and other things, but it breathes, and it makes breathing noises and then randomly purrs. It is creepy. But my 3-year-old daughter is carrying it around the house, calling it her kitty, and so that was a bright spot of the weekend. Even though it's a creepy little machine, that machine cannot eat things and not digest it. So algae are interesting. So yeah, one way to answer this question of why don't land plants have some of the pigments in red and brown algae? One way to answer that is because they don't come from the same ancestor, right? That's one way to answer this question. They don't come from the same ancestor, therefore you'd expect there to be some differences. Another way is they live in different environments. Yes, there are aquatic plants, but they tend to be in very shallow waters. Some of our brown algae and red algae are in really deep waters. And so they have to absorb light that has already been, I don't know if you knew this or not, but blue light is really the only wavelength of light that penetrates beyond like 20 or 30 feet of water. It's only blue. Everything else bends and kind of gets forced back to the surface, all of the other colors. And so if you live deeper than 20 or 30 feet or so, there's no value in any pigment that is going to absorb anything other than blue. That make sense? So another way to answer this question, they live in different environments. And you're like, yeah, but there are aquatic plants. There are, but they tend to be very shallow water plants. Like seagrasses, what are some other, I'm trying to think of some other marine plants. You've got seagrasses, and there are some others, I can't think of them right now. Mangroves, you got mangrove trees, those are as well, and then you've got some others. But they tend to be shallow marine environments where you get the full like slate of colors. Okay? All right. Is that okay? Okay, so you've taken home from this green plants and green plants. Plants and green algae are believed to share a common ancestor. Other algae and plants are not. Okay? Right? We're all on the same page? Cool. Happy Monday, by the way. I don't know if I told you that already, but you feel like you could use it again, even if I already told you. It's a little heavy in here. All right. I know I probably brought up something that hurt you deeply when I reminded you of USC's whooping they got from Texas on Saturday. All right, so why do algae produce drought-resistant structures? I mean, algae, they don't live on land, right? They live in water. What on earth are they producing drought-resistant structures for? Because if you are going to get land plants from algae, there are certain things that already need to be there. You need to have the ability to move onto land, right? Does that make sense? And living on land is tough. It's hard, right? I mean, Ariel wanted it so badly. So badly. And she got it. And they do away with most of the tough stuff. I mean, the only thing she experienced came from the water anyways, right, Ursula? But anyways, I know but it's hard. It's hard. And here are some of the things that are hard. I made a Disney reference for you, and that's all I get. Thanks, you, Anders. Thank you. All right. So here are some of the risks of living on land. You risk desiccation, and so that's a fancy way of saying drying out, right? You're not surrounded by water anymore. Okay, so you risk drying out. Gravity isn't balanced with buoyancy. So you don't, at the same time that gravity is pulling you down, you don't have water pushing you back up. You're like, well, then why is that challenging? Well, if you just want to lay, passively on the ground, it's not challenging at all, right? But if you want to actually be able to stand up, against that gravity, it's tough. The sunlight isn't filtered, right? You're getting the full force of sunlight, not just the full amount of visible light, but the entire electromagnetic spectrum. You're getting it all. There's nothing to filter out some of that. And you're like, what about the ozone and the ozone layer? It filters out some of that. You're right. Relax. But you're getting way more than you would underwater. And another thing is gametes can't swim. The gametes, the sperm of green algae, swim to the ova. You can't do that on land, right? Do you agree that you can't swim on land? It's hard, right? You end up making like a sand angel. Sorry, that's all I got. And you're like, man, this is really hard. Why would some green algal species have made this move onto land and then given rise to land plants? Well, at the same time that it's hard and it's tough, there are also rewards. There's some rewards to living on land. Right? I was going to sing the song from Little Mermaid, but I'll pass. You can think about it in your head. I was so close, but I can't do it. I can't. No, maybe another day. All right. So look at this one. UV light isn't filtered. This is weird. Isn't that one of the things that make it tough? Yes, but it's also not filtered, so you get the full spectrum. You get more energy out of that sunlight. Yeah, it has greater potential to damage your tissues, but you get more energy out of that sunlight. Carbon dioxide is more abundant on land, and you're like, that's weird. Why is that a benefit? How is that a reward? What do photosynthetic organisms need? CO2, right? It's one of the reactants of photosynthesis. With no carbon dioxide, there is no making sugars. And if you can't make sugars, then you're just sad, right? And hungry. Predation is lower. And you're like, well, this doesn't make sense. But in terms of how difficult it is to graze on land versus grazing in water, and this would be especially true if land plants really did come from algae and they made the move onto land initially, because there wouldn't be any animals there yet, right? And how would you know that there'd be no animals on land before plants moved there? There's nothing to eat, right? You can't have animals living on land with no plants, because then there's nothing for them to eat. And if there's nothing for the animals to eat, there are no animals for us to eat. And it's sad. Right? Okay, so predation is lower. So there definitely would be some benefits to moving onto land. So, but what's interesting is there are certain features that have to be in this algae in order to just move onto land. And here are some of those features. So this is going to say plants combat this, but this would also be the original green algal species that moved onto land for the first time. It would need to have this as well. So plants combat desiccation and gravity through what is called the alternation of generations. And so we'll come back to that concept in a little bit. But yeah, the alternation of generations, you saw this in lab this week, right? Where I had you draw the gametophyte and the sporophyte of both moss and liverworts. Do you remember those terms? Yeah, I got blocked out lab. That was last week. I turned in my sketches. I'm never going to think about it again. It's not good. Don't do that. I know it sounds so nice, and you're like, I just want to never think about it again, but don't do it. Don't do it to yourself. Okay? But you've got the gametophyte and the sporophyte. So they alternate generations, and so it makes it to where a particular generation doesn't have to last long enough to reach sexual maturity because they can split that up. They can split that process up. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, yeah, but what about a tree that lives 600 years? It's like, yeah, they've split that up, but now you have this sporophyte living 600 years. We'll talk about that next week, okay? Save that question. It's a good one. The apical meristem. You're like, what on earth is that? So your apical meristem is the part of the plant that grows up, okay? And it grows up. And it does it actually, it's seemingly knowing where gravity is acting. So if you plant a seed right side up to where, did you know that seeds basically always open at the same place? Did you know that? So if you put a seed open side up or you put it open side down, the plant's going to know where to grow. You're like, how does it do that? It's like once sunlight is there, it makes sense, right? It's going to move towards the sunlight. But when it's in the soil, how does it do that? And it does it probably in response to gravity. Okay, that it's got a part that actually grows up, opposite of gravity. Well, that's pretty cool. It's got a waxy cuticle. I have no idea what that means. I mean, I know what it means, and you probably know what it means as well. The cuticle is the outer covering, and it's waxy. What do we know about waxes? They repel water, right? We call that hydrophobic. They literally fear water. And you're like, how does it I mean, it doesn't literally fear water, but that's what the term actually means. But they repel water. So if you're covered in wax, water can't leave that surface because it can't cross through that wax. It's wonderful. And then look at this one, lignin-infused walls. What is that? It strengthens the cell walls which surround the cells so the plant doesn't collapse in response to gravity, that it can stand up. It's fantastic. And so you're like, man, the original green algal species that gave rise to the land plants, it would have had to have some of these features. And what you find is, you find some green algal species that have some of these features, and you find them on land. Yeah, Levi.
How did we start to see these traits in that algae that didn't?
How did we? Well, I don't think we did. I think they existed. They both existed at the same time. But anyways.
How did they become successful with those species that live in the water even though they never get to make the move to land? How did those structures become?
Oh, why do they still have those structures?
Yeah.
It's a wonderful question. And as far as we can tell, those that are restricted just to water don't. They don't have these structures. Only the green algae that actually do grow on land have some of these structures.
The drought.
Yeah, again, that the green algae, that the only green algae with those structures are those that live at least for a time on land.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. All right. So we've got one group of green algae known as Corylus. These are believed to be the closest relatives to land plants of all the green algae. These are believed to be the group that probably gave rise to land plants because they have these features. They have lignin that helps them stand up against gravity. They've got this structure that protects their gametes called sporopollenin. They have some other structures that you find in plants, and we'll see these later. So they're here now, but we'll see them again later. If you're like, how am I supposed to, what is a plasmodesmata? We'll see that later, so we'll save that for another time. And fertilization is internal. Instead of having the female and male gametes fertilize outside of the individual, fertilization takes place internally. And then within Corylus, the group believed to be absolutely most closely related to land plants genetically is this group here, Zygnametalis. So these are the most genetically similar to land plants. These are the most morphologically similar to land plants. You're like, wow, this is awesome. I don't know exactly what I'm going to do with this yet, but I know it's valuable, and I'm going to store it away, right? Store it away. I get it. All right. Any questions? We're going to do a lecture break. Now it's Monday, and we're like 30 minutes in. Y'all did well, considering that. I didn't know we were 30 minutes in. Good job. It's a great job. Are you ready for a lecture break?
Yeah.
And so for our I don't know, maybe our 3 previous lecture breaks, we've been focusing on, like, what would you need if this were the ancestor and to generate all of these forms? Okay, right? We've been focusing on that. I want to do a similar question, but basically the opposite perspective. What would you predict about green algae and land plants if they did not share an ancestor? What would you predict? What would you predict as far as the differences between the two? What would you predict about as far as like when you might find them in the fossil record? Okay? What would you predict if they never actually shared ancestry? If they were created separately? Did you have a question about that, or were you going to answer that?
Can you just say the question again?
Yeah. So the question I want you to work on is, what would you predict to find, about the structural aspects of green algae and plants, about the fossil record of green algae and plants, if they do not share ancestors, if they don't actually connect together and came from the same, but they were separate creations, created separately, and have always been separate. What would you predict? What would you predict? Okay, take a couple of minutes, talk about it with those around you, see if you can come up with a few things that you would predict.
They didn't share a common ancestor. I mean, there was definitely. Yeah, there would definitely be differences in the way that they're Yeah, which there are.
All right. Anyone have some ideas on what we should expect if green algae and land plants never shared an ancestor? What would you expect? Let's focus in on like morphological differences. Is that what you had, Levi? Or just give us what you got. Give us.
What we have is that they might share a lot of physical characteristics.
Okay.
That they have to survive in some of those environments.
Sure. So how about let's say that the characteristics that they share would be better explained by similar needs than they would by common ancestry.
So if they didn't share common ancestry, you'd see the more genetic distinctions than physical distinctions.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting one because this group that's most similar to plants genetically is not the one that's most similar to plants morphologically. The one that's most similar to plants morphologically does not look closely related to plants genetically, or at least not as closely related to plants genetically as others, but it lives in a similar environment. And so again, providing evidence that maybe the similarities are better explained by similar needs rather than by common ancestry. Maybe. Any other predictions? We've got one. We need more. Yeah, Micah.
We were talking about like the morphological differences, especially in algae, like those waxy cuticle, lignin infused walls,
Yep.
color. They wouldn't have a waxy cuticle because
Okay.
they'd be surrounded by water.
Sure.
They wouldn't need to worry about drying up,
Right.
and they'd have buoyancy. So
Yeah.
They need these stronger walls.
So that there'd be some features that you have to live on land that you don't find in any green algae. Is that what you're getting?
Right.
So that there's very
Environmental difference.
yeah, there's very much a morphological discontinuity. You've got things that you only find in land plants that you don't find in green algae, meaning that you have to have some way to generate them for the first time before you could even move on to land. Yeah, Autumn.
Are there things that we see in green algae that land plants don't have?
Yes. Yeah, yes. We'll talk about some of that, but yes, they have some pigments that you don't find in land plants. So they have some pigments that land plants don't use, although they have the most similar pigments to land plants. They have mobile gametes. Their sperm are flagellated and swim. Most land plants don't have that. There are some that only reproduce in water, so like mosses and things like that that can't reproduce outside of water. But there are some features like that. It's a good question. What about the fossil record? Anybody talk about that at all? Because if they don't share ancestry, what would you predict about their fossil history? Yeah, Alice.
Well, when we were talking, we were wondering, and I don't know what creation scientists say about this, but did God create the algae when He created the oceans, and then the plants a day later, or were they?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what. I would say I have not thought enough to have a position on that, and I've never thought to ask when somebody thinks that God created algae. Was it on day 3 when He separated the land from the water, right? And when land plants were created, or was it before that? Yeah, I don't know.
I guess either way, they'd be really close in the fossil record.
Yeah.
It was only a day apart.
Yeah. But you might predict that there's just, I don't know, what I might predict is like if you tried to make a story from the fossil record, it's going to be a mess. Because they're going to be there at the same time, and it's just, there's going to be a lot of different types of land plants that show up all at once without really a sense of how they got to be there. Does that make sense? Is that something you might predict? Or you have no idea? You're like, it's Monday, I don't know what I would predict. Other than that, I'm going to take a nap very shortly after this class. I would take a nap in this class, but you talk way, way too loud, Doctor. I get it. It's part of my strategy. If I could keep the room cold too, I would do that, but I guess I actually can control the thermostat in this room. Yeah, Tara.
Do you mean about this like the fossil record that there would be intermediate?
Yeah, that you wouldn't find a lot of intermediate forms, right, connecting them, and that when plants show up, that they're just a whole bunch of different types of plants, right? That's what I would predict. And it's kind of cheating because I know what the fossil record of plants looks like, but I would predict that even if I didn't know. And what's interesting is when you look at the fossil record of plants, and we'll see this in a little bit, when plants first show up, they show up with an incredible diversity of plants. It's just like once you start finding plants in the fossil record, you find a whole bunch of different types of plants. Whole bunch of different types of plants. And what's interesting is you find green algae in the fossil record later than you do plants. It's kind of strange. So trying to tell the story from the fossil record, it's tough. It's not good. It's not really helpful. Yeah, Levi.
So, is there any possibility that green algae came from plants? Like they
Sure.
back into
Sure, why not? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, green algae. So if you, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's possible. Sure. It's a lot of diversity. There are a lot of different types of green algae. So here's the alternation of generations. You saw this in lab. We had gametophytes and we had sporophytes. You saw that gametophytes make gametes, sporophytes make spores, right? You saw this in lab. You sketched it. I don't know if you knew what you were sketching, but this is some of the idea of what you're sketching. Don't worry. I know you're sitting there, you're worried. You're like, how am I going to remember all this? We'll do some more. We'll do some more with this gametophyte versus sporophyte. It's not over. Our discussion of it is not done. But here's an image of a gametophyte. Here's the gametophyte. Can you see the blades? It's a little blurry, but here's the gametophyte. And then here's a sac on the gametophyte that is the sporophyte. The sporophyte producing spores. Okay? Yeah, it's beautiful. Beautiful. So here's the apical meristem, and so you'd have some here at the root cap where you have rapid growth, and then up at the top you have rapid growth, growing both directly towards where the center of gravity is and growing directly opposite of where the center of gravity is. It's fantastic. Something you find in land plants and in some of our green algae. Here's a figure right out of your textbook, and this is a good one. This is a good one to just show you some of the variety of green algae, but you saw some of these in lab. And so you actually drew this one in lab, Spirogyra. You drew that in lab. I think that might be, you drew something like this. Oh, you did draw ova. You took a single blade of that. Yeah, so you drew some of these in lab. Here's a green algae that is in the group that is morphologically very similar to plants. Morphologically very similar to plants. Genetically, not the most similar. Morphologically, fairly similar to plants. All right? You look at that, you're like, yeah, it kind of looks like a plant. Maybe? No? Okay. I'm trying my best. Okay? Trying my best. I don't know if you're getting my best, but I am trying my best. All right, we did it. We made it to the third question. Made it to the third question. So why can mosses grow where there isn't any soil? Why can mosses grow where there isn't any soil? So in order to answer this, we need to talk a little bit about how do we classify plants. So remember, today we're entirely in one drawer of that 6-drawer file cabinet. And what's that drawer called? Archaeplastida. And what's inside that drawer? Plants and green algae. And that's it. Green algae and plants. But now if we wanted to organize plants, we can't just put them all in the same folder because it's not helpful. There's so many different types of plants. So we need to start to divide plants into different groups. First group is what we're talking about this week, seedless plants. Seedless plants, one of the two groups of plants. What do you think the other group is called? Seed plants, right? So wonderful. Seedless and seed plants. Within seedless plants, we have non-vascular forms called the Bryophytes, and that's what we focused on in lab, although we did also have some vascular forms, but non-vascular Bryophytes. These are mosses, liverworts, are believed to have developed in the Ordovician. We're not going to talk about that right this moment. We'll talk about that more on Wednesday. Bless you. Because if we talk about it right this moment, then you have to be prepared to talk about it on the exam on Friday. And I don't think you're ready. So we'll wait. We'll talk about that. What is the Ordovician? We'll talk about that on Wednesday. All right. So inside of seedless plants, we also have vascular plants, lycophytes, which are ferns, pterophytes, dominate the Silurian and beyond. Again, another word, we're not ready for that yet. But it's there, you can write it down, you can store it up for later application. Okay, seedless plants. What's the other group? Seed plants. Look at that. Not only are you critically thinking, but you're actually repeating what I already told you, right? There's so much excellence happening right now. Seed plants. Okay, so that's two ways, two groups that we can put our plants into. In lab, we only worked with seedless plants. I don't know if you knew that or not. This week in lab, we'll do seed plants. You'll love it. Because we'll have fruit in lab, but you can't eat it because it's a lab. It's not allowed. But there'll be fruit nonetheless. And especially if you have the Tuesday lab that goes over lunch, it's going to be great. Have lots of fun. Okay, so our bryophytes, which again include the mosses and liverworts, the dominant life stage here is the gametophyte stage. That's the stage that you saw. We had living moss right on the soil in the little containers. This gametophyte stage, and the gametophyte stage and just bryophytes in general lack cells that transfer water. We call those tracheids, these cells that transfer water. And so that's why we call them non-vascular. They don't have these vessels that form for carrying water. Which means if they don't have vessels that form for carrying water, what should they not have? What structure of a plant pulls water out of the soil so that it can be taken to all parts of the plant? The roots, right? Does that make sense? They do not have roots. Yep, bryophytes do not have roots. So they can grow anywhere. It doesn't matter whether there's soil or not. Right? Have you ever seen a rock covered in moss? Or have you heard the saying, a rolling stone gathers no moss? Right? It's a way to tell people to stop being lazy. Right? Or idle hands are the devil's playground, right? It's like, start doing something. You know? Wow. Nothing. I even connected it to a saying that you've heard before, and I get no response. No response. Yeah, Chris.
So what's the word that we in lab last week when we were looking at the bryophytes that they attach to it, but they're not roots. They're like the
Oh, the rhizomes.
Is that what they use to hold on?
Yes.
To stuff?
Yeah, it's still like a hold fast structure, but it doesn't penetrate into the soil.
Okay.
Yeah. 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 So they can grow basically anywhere, any solid substrate that they can grab onto. Yeah, Allison.
Do they absorb water then just through the cell wall?
Everywhere. Yep. Every cell has to absorb its own water and prevent its own water loss. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So here's a figure out of your textbook, and this is actually a really, really helpful table.
What number is it?
Wow. That's a wonderful question. This thing is in the way.
It says figure 25.6.
There, yeah, but you ruined the surprise. I moved the table for you. Figure 25.6. And that's actually only in the first edition because they came out with the second edition of the textbook like a month ago, and so I don't know if the figure numbers are the same. But I've been using the first edition of the textbook. Anyways, this is a really nice chart. So notice its first break is not seedless versus seed, but rather non-vascular versus vascular. But the same idea is conveyed here. You have seedless vascular, seedless non-vascular. Okay? Seedless vascular, seedless non-vascular. And so we've got liverworts, mosses, another group hornworts. You didn't see those in lab, and we won't talk about them much. Seedless vascular, lycophytes, pterophytes, ferns, and club mosses, which we might have had, but then didn't end up having, so you drew it out of the photo atlas. And then next week will all be about seed plants. The reason why this figure or this table is so nice is it does such a wonderful job of organizing plants. And then you're like, okay, in here we've got a few dozen species, a few dozen species, a few dozen species, just a few, maybe a couple hundred species. And then you get to here and it's like thousands of species. And then you get to here and it's hundreds of thousands of species. And the reason why that I like this table is because it creates the illusion that every cell is equal. But it's not the case at all. Like 99% of plants are in this one cell. But the table reminds you that there's value in all the cells, even if there are very few species.
All cells matter.
Yeah. What's that?
I said it's like all cells matter.
Yeah, all cells matter. Yep. All right. Any questions? Thoughts? So I have a dilemma, and here's the dilemma, and I want you all to participate with me in my dilemma. Is I only prepared to handle the first 3 questions, but I don't want to accuse you all of anything, but just so we can be fair, the level of interaction today has not been great. So we moved through the material more quickly than I had envisioned. So here's the dilemma. I am in no way prepared to actually move on in the slides, but we have 9 minutes of class left. So here's the dilemma. Do we end class 9 minutes early? And you can stick around and ask questions if you want, or go on to the rest of the day. Wow, that was perfect timing. She did leave her stuff though. So, or actually, I have no alternative. That's what we're gonna do. It is 12:31. Just have a joyful Monday.
Perfect.